Like, I actually don't sit around thinking a lot about how I can diversify Hollywood. I spend a lot more time thinking about how I can make Hollywood more of a meritocracy, because I know that if it was more of a true meritocracy, real diversity would be inevitable. Because I don't believe, and I don't think anybody believes, that any group of people has a exclusive or competitive advantage when it comes to storytelling.
Welcome to the Design of Business,
the business of design,
where we introduce you to people from all over the world, from different industries and disciplines,
who are here to talk about design, business, civility, and the values that govern how we work and live together.
This season, we are observing equity.
I'm Jessica Helfand.
And I'm Ellen McGirt. This episode of the Design of Business, the business of design, is powered by Deloitte's DEI Institute. Deloitte believes that bold actions can help drive equitable outcomes, and conversations like this can fuel the change needed to continue to build a more equitable society. Visit Deloitte's DEI Institute site at deloitte.com/US/DEI Institute for more of their research and perspectives on equity. Hey, Jessica.
Hey, Ellen.
We are back with another inspiring redesigner. Today's guest happens to be someone who I've known since the early days of his career, and I just think the world of him.
I believe you said you'd pick him up from the airport.
Indeed, I did, which is the highest compliment coming from a New Yorker.
We are talking about Franklin Leonard, who is the founder and CEO of The Blacklist, which he started in 2005 as a list of the best unproduced screenplays in Hollywood. Over the past 20 years, The Blacklist has evolved into a platform that nurtures emerging screenwriters and gives screenplays that aren't attached to a big producer, actor, or studio a chance to be produced.
Now, you've probably seen or heard of some of the films that got their start as blacklisted screenplays. Films like Slumdog Millionaire, King Richard, Juno, and Little Miss Sunshine. As of 2023, 440 blacklist scripts have been produced. These movies have received, get this, 267 total Oscar noms, 54 wins, and have grossed $30 billion in box office worldwide.
Unbelievable. Ellen, you met Franklin before those 267 yes. Oscar nominations and before the $30 billion in box office revenue. Is that right?
Yes. He was in Fast Company early on. He was at an event of ours in 2006-ish. I would have picked him up from the airport then, Jessica. He was so clearly going someplace with this idea. It was so compelling. And I mean, the Blacklist was barely out of the idea stage at that point. But
so the $1 million question, or maybe I should say the $30 billion question that we're going to be asking each other a lot this season, why is Franklin Leonard such a great fit for this season of the Design of Business, Business of Design podcast, where we're looking so carefully at redesign and redesigners?
Yeah, there are so many reasons. Thank you for asking that, including the very real one that everything is better when the stories we're able to tell and discover reflect the lives and imaginations of a wide array of people. But I think the thing that people really get wrong about diversity and equity, since we're observing equity where it flourishes, is that it's lowering the bar somehow. In fact, it's widening the search for talent that have been shut out or ignored. And Franklin and his team have proven that widening the scope in this way and letting people in is great entertainment and even better business.
Unbelievable. It's so true. I've been thinking about this conversation a lot since we recorded it for a number of reasons, and let me give you two. First of all, it was a lovely day because we were together in New York with our wonderful producer, Alexis, and we were all in the same room recording this interview live and in person.
Yeah.
And two, Franklin was such a rich subject for interview, but for conversation, his perspectives were wise and nuanced. And he goes after huge topics. He's fearless in this way that dominate kind of our current cultural moment and discussion, like, for example, the legacy of Hollywood's historical failures, or the anxiety over the future of movies in the media, debates over what actually constitutes truth on screen, what representation really looks like.
That is such a powerful observation, Jessica. That nuance and wisdom that you mentioned is well earned. He's taken the time to understand his industry and think deeply about what it needs to be a better version of itself because he loves film and filmmakers and storytelling. That's where he's coming from. And that's the very powerful position to really think about how can you make this better and more equitable. But let's not keep him from our audience any longer. Here is our conversation with Franklin Leonard, founder and CEO of The Blacklist. But I was explaining to them like what it was like to meet you when you were first starting out. You came to Fast Company. We felt like we discovered you, although you were absolutely non-discoverable. You were a person doing this amazing work. And it has just been such a joy to see how your work has developed over the years and how you've evolved into this powerhouse of a person. That's like the ultimate New Yorker sort of compliment is like, I'd pick him up at the airport. That's how I feel about you, Franklin.
It's very, very good to know. Next time I need to get out of LaGuardia or JFK.
Put her on speed dial now.
Yeah.
It's very flattering. I mean, I think when you're in it, you don't really, I tend not to think about the growth. Like I distinctly remember when I came to New York for the Fast Company event. And I distinctly remember vomiting in the green room before I had to go on stage and speak because I was not doing a lot of speaking then. And I still get anxious about it, nervous now. But yeah, it's been quite the decade.
I share with you that nervousness, and one would never know to watch your TED Talk, which I did yesterday on the train coming down to New York from Redesign. And I just...
The TED Talk has a great bit of context on the nervousness front. I'll just share this story. So my TEDx talk was directly after Diane von Furstenberg's TEDx talk. And we were in the green room together because, they do them in like groups of 3 or 4. And so the first 2 people go. And so there's a moment when just Diane von Furstenberg and I are in the green room together, which is already like a moment one remembers. And I remember being like more anxious about like not sounding like an idiot and talking to her than I did about going out and giving my TED Talk. But about 2 minutes before she leaves to go on stage, she looks at me, and I was wearing this leather jacket over the t-shirt that I was wearing. She just looks at me and she's like, "You're not going to wear that, are you?"
Oh, no.
And
God, no.
it's Diane von Furstenberg. So like, what am I going to be like? No, I definitely am. So then she leaves to go give her talk, and I'm sitting in the green room by myself for about 15 minutes, just debating whether I'm going to wear this jacket. And if you watched the TED Talk yesterday, you'll know that I did not wear the jacket because, if Diane von Furstenberg gives you fashion notes, you take them.
You should have worn a wrap dress. That would have taught her.
I mean, if I had known, I definitely would have considered it. But it was funny because I think it actually distracted me enough from the fact that I was about to go out to do this talk that I ended up doing it without feeling too much nervousness.
Interesting. I wonder if you'll have an opportunity at some point to give her advice on the movie she pitches.
I will absolutely tell her this. She definitely won't remember it, but I'll definitely tell her the story if I run into her again.
Well, we are just delighted to have you today, and we have so many questions to ask you. I'd like to begin with really that classic question, which is for you to share a little bit of your origin story. We know a little bit from what we've read, but really tell us what got you where you were when you began the Blacklist, which we're going to be talking about in a moment. Tell us a little bit about what happened before, what got you there.
Yeah, I'd say it's a long and circuitous route. And there's sort of there's 2 parts of the story. The first is my journey to Hollywood, and I guess my second is my journey to creating the Blacklist. I was a Black kid in West Central Georgia growing up. My father was in the Army, so I was born in Hawaii and lived in El Paso, Texas, and Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, and Germany for 3 years, all before I was 8 years old. And then we moved to Columbus when his mother died so that he could take care of his father, and that was where I grew up. And I was a big nerd. I made the joke before that I was Steve Urkel while Steve Urkel was on television, which was not really great for my social life. I think I had a lot of solitary time as a kid. And a lot of that time was spent doing schoolwork, and the other part of that time was spent in movie theaters. Once I reached the age where my mom felt comfortable letting me go to the movie theater by myself. So I'd say I probably saw like most studio releases of movies from 1991 to 1996 when I left for college, really just as a way to kill time. And then I went to Harvard for undergraduate. I thought I was going to be a math major, again, going back to the Urkel thing. When I got to Harvard, I realized very quickly that there's a very big difference between being good at math in Georgia and being good at math at Harvard. So I ended up majoring in a degree, concentrating in a department called social studies, which is social and political theory and you know social psychology, economics, sociology, and thought I was going to go into politics. And the day after I graduated from college, I moved to Cincinnati, Ohio, to help run a congressional campaign that was run by a candidate named John Cranley, who spent some time as mayor of Cincinnati afterwards. We lost a very close race. I ended up moving to Trinidad, which is where my mom's dad is from, and wrote for the Guardian newspapers for a bit. Got bored, and then moved to New York to take a consulting job that I'd been offered while I was still in college. Did that for 2 years and hated the job. Was about to quit when me and the rest of my analyst class got laid off with 5 months severance. And then I spent a bunch of time in New York, where I was living at the time, just trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. I'd taken the LSAT. I didn't want to go to law school. I found myself watching a lot of movies again and reading about the film industry. And I realized that it had never really occurred to me to pursue a career in that direction. I think growing up Black in South Georgia, it would have been easier for me to become an astronaut because I was really good at math and a decent soccer player. So I was an athlete, than it would have been for me to say, oh, I'll just move to LA and figure it out. So I ended up in this social slipstream as having gone to Harvard, and I took a month in Los Angeles. It was snowing in New York and I wanted to be somewhere warm. So I moved to LA for a month, March of 2003. 2 days into my trip, I had an interview to be an assistant at Creative Artist Agency and started working there the following Monday, which again wouldn't have happened if I didn't have social relationships that allowed me to get that interview, which allowed me to get that job. And that's sort of how I ended up shipwrecked on the shores of Los Angeles, if you will.
The social relationships piece is a pretty important piece when I think about what happened next. I picture you poolside with a handful of scripts, a slush pile next to you, and then you sent out the bat signal and asked for help. Is that sort of how it happened?
Yes, except for the pool part.
I like to picture it.
No, so look, so my first couple years in Hollywood, I was an assistant to an agent who represented writers and directors at CAA. I was an executive briefly for a producer named John Golan who had a deal at Paramount. And then I got poached to go help run development, to work for Leo's producing partner, Leonardo DiCaprio's producing partner. And, my job was to find great scripts and great writers who could write things or be things that Leo could star in or produce. And most of the things that I was reading, I would say fell in the category of mediocre to bad. I knew very early on in my career that my competitive advantage was not going to be being the cool guy or like knowing all of the right people, but I could read and retain more than most. So I would take home 20, 25 scripts a weekend and like just sit in my very small 1-bedroom apartment and just like, with a banker's box full of scripts next to me and just churn through them. And again, most of the things that I was reading weren't things that I could walk into my boss's office the next Monday and slam down on the desk and say, this is your priority now. Or at least I couldn't do that in good conscience. And, my mom would call me once a week and ask if my LSAT scores were still valid.
Once a mom, always a mom.
And, I mean, it was in retrospect, it was probably the forcing function that made me come up with all of this. So I owe her a great deal of thanks. But I remember sitting in my office on Sunset Boulevard in November of 2005 at this point, thinking that, well, she might be right here. If I can't find good scripts, which is literally my job, either I'm bad at my job, which is finding good scripts, or the actual job is reading bad scripts and passing on them. In either case, I needed a solution. And so I, went through my calendar from 2005, made a list of everyone I had had breakfast, lunch, dinner, or drinks with who had a job similar to mine. And I sent an anonymous email to those people asking for a list of their favorite 10 unproduced scripts that they read for the first time that calendar year, and promised that in exchange I would share them back the combined list. And that's what I did. I sort of gathered all of the responses. I think all but 3 people responded, and maybe another 5 asked for a coworker to participate. Ran it through a pivot table, exported it to PowerPoint, and slapped a quasi-subversive name on it and sent it back out, and then went on vacation. And by the time I came back, it had sort of gone viral within the industry. And everywhere I would go socially, people were talking about this list and where did it come from? And the scripts were really good that were on it. And I just kept quiet because I was sure that someone, when they found out that it was me, I would be run out of town on rails and forced to go to law school, which again, I did not want to do.
Lucky for all of us, that didn't happen. At what point in this process that you so beautifully described for us did you come up with this subversive idea of invoking what I think to some people would be a reference to McCarthyism, but obviously plays on many different, has other valences, this idea of calling it the blacklist? When did that enter the picture?
Probably in the 2 hours before I sent it out the first time. I think, I think I've always been fascinated by language, and I've always looked for ways to play with language and make a point in my language usage. I just have realized that's like a natural default instinct that I have, and I think in this case it was, okay, I need to name this thing. It's a list of scripts, so a list. What other historical lists might be relevant? And I think for me, I've always had a great deal of reverence, even before I sort of thought seriously about working in the film industry, for the filmmakers, the film professionals who lost their career during the McCarthy era, and screenwriters, I think, were principal among them. So it was that reference felt comfortable. And then simultaneously, this notion of color symbolism in literature and art. I remember being a middle schooler in West Central Georgia and being in English class and being explained that if you see a cowboy with a white hat, that they're probably the good guy. And if you see a cowboy with the black hat, they're probably the bad guy. And, I didn't know what mathematical induction was then, but I definitely had the instinct that inductively I was not comfortable with that sort of organization of information. And I remember as a kid thinking, one day I'm going to write a novel that inverts all of that. And I have not gotten around to doing that yet. But I do remember thinking when we named the list, what if there was a blacklist that people wanted to be on? What if black was a positive signifier in this case? And so the combination of those two things just felt right to me. And I sent it out. But again, I think it's important to remember, I didn't make the blacklist trying to make a thing. I really was trying to solve a very specific problem that I had. And it felt to me as though the optimal solution to that problem required this sort of communitarian approach. And the name was just something that I put on there as self-amusement more than anything, because I had no expectation that it was going to be something that anybody cared about except for me.
And now, nearly 20 years later, it is a thing. Can we unpack a little bit what the impact is? I know there's some really straightforward metrics, movies that would never have been made or may never have been made, But I'm also, let's talk about that. And then let's talk about the cultural impact, the kinds of things that's a little more difficult to measure.
The blacklist has been around. This December will be our 20th year. I think there have been about 1,500 scripts on the list. A third of them have been produced. They've made over $30 billion in worldwide box office. They've won 50 Oscars from, I think, about 300 nominations, including 4 Best Pictures and 11 Screenwriting Oscars since 2007. Maybe most joyously for my mother, who's still mad that I didn't go to grad school, Harvard Business School did a study on the annual list just before the pandemic and found that movies made from scripts on the blacklist, controlling for all other factors, make about 90% more in revenue than movies made from scripts not on the blacklist. The other thing that I think is really important for me to say when I talk about all these numbers is that, I didn't make any of these movies, right? I didn't produce them, direct them. I didn't do craft service on these movies. I cannot claim any of the credit for the success of these movies individually. That credit goes to the artists and people and practitioners who made them. I think what we can take credit for, and I say we now because the blacklist is a team of people, for building a metal detector that does better than any other at identifying things that, if they are invested in further by talented people, have a better chance of success, both critically and commercially. And then I think we've industrialized that metal detector with the work that we've done with the Blacklist website and everything we've built on top of that sense. But I will admit to feeling very uncomfortable talking about the cultural impact of the blacklist because I'm the one that made it, and so anybody should rightly distrust any judgment of its impact from me, lest I be, you know, a bit ego driven in that description.
I think that Ellen's comment speaks as much to the community that you've worked with and for as the culture and the cultural impact. And on that subject, I want to ask you a question about what you describe as being such a complicated community, right? So many moving parts, so many different skill sets, including, as you say in your TED Talk, also craft services, which I love. But I wonder how and at what point, it seems quite early from my read, but you tell us, you came upon the discovery that the real engine here is the writing. That it's not the ego of the director or the showcase for the star or even the box office number speculation from any number of analysts, but actually an idea and words that put that idea into some kind of motion that then gets gathered into an important list. Is that because you were reading scripts for a living? Is that because you're just smarter than the rest of us? Just to tell me. I really want to know.
It's interesting. I think it's a good question. When I think about my history of watching movies, I think that I was always aware that there was a person who wrote the thing, right? So whatever movie I watched, even as a kid, I remember thinking, okay, I'm seeing these actors. I know that there's a director who's responsible for shooting all of this stuff, but like somewhere at the very beginning, someone had to go into a room by themselves and almost godlike create these people, create these dynamics, create this thing. And everything was built atop of that. And we as the audience, the wellspring from which all of this comes is a writer. If you think about how a movie gets made and you go back far enough, somewhere it began with a person and an idea. And none of it exists without that. So I think that was sort of the context in which I entered the industry. I think very early on in my career, my first boss, Rowena Arguelles, who's still an agent at CAA and a dear friend of mine, and my first boss when I was an executive, John Goldwyn, I think both of them really emphasized the value of a good script. Rowena was representing a lot of directors that were coming out of the indie space, people like Patty Jenkins, Justin Lin. She signed Taika Waititi when I was working for her. These were folks who were storytellers first and foremost and directors secondly, but they were all writer-directors. And then John Goldwyn, I remember him telling me, listen, if you can get a great script, you can get a great director. And if you can get a great script and a great director, you can get the actors. And then the rest is downhill. And that really stuck with me. And it made a lot of sense, right? Like just on a pure, how do you put this thing together? Start with a great thing that will get other great things to join up. And I think that thesis has really been borne out. I think the other real takeaway from the HBS study is that Hollywood undervalues the sort of economic value of a good screenplay and writers. And I think you see that borne out in the writer's strike, in the relative celebration that you see for writers vis-a-vis directors and actors, the relative compensation that they receive. It on some level, it just seems like blindingly obvious to me that all of this is built atop of the work of writers. But then when you really dig in on the numbers, that thesis gets confirmed again and again and again. And I think it's frankly one of Hollywood's great failures that it continues to undervalue writers. And if we valued them more and prioritize finding good ones, I think we as an industry would see significantly better financial outcomes and significantly better creative ones too.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. Let's dig into Hollywood's failures, because I think that there's plenty to talk about here, and you could probably.
How long you got?
I know, baby. I just, we got the studio. You just keep talking. But I want to talk about the business case for diversity in film, because I focus on the business case for diversity in business, and it is a fraught argument. There's a now famous study that you cite that accounts for a loss of some $10 billion due to anti-Black bias. And there's that. There's the fact that Hollywood is a challenging place to work, and I don't just mean sort of the sexual scandals that we've seen play out over the number of years. Just they don't even pay their assistants properly. You cannot start in the mailroom and end up going anywhere. You had you had a very smart way of framing your move into Hollywood, that you had the slipstream of social contact that was helpful. For anybody else who comes from a truly underrepresented population, they're not getting there from there. So what is really going on here with Hollywood? Any way that you want to enter I give you a magic wand. What's happening? What are you fixing?
So, I mean, let me try to parse through that. I feel like there were three parts to that question. The first was the sort of generalized diversity question, and specifically the cost of anti-Black bias to Hollywood economically. The second was Me Too, and then the third was sort of economic exclusion. Am I getting that roughly right?
That's perfect. You should actually be the host of the podcast.
Time for me to retire.
So, I mean, look, I'll try to address all three, but I think they're intertwined, right? So yeah, look, my former consulting employers, shortly after George Floyd's murder, did a study on the economic costs of anti-Black bias in Hollywood, and what they found was that the industry is missing out on about $10 billion every year as a consequence of anti-Black bias, and that comes in many forms. That comes in the form of under investing in films made by and about Black people. So if you look at the numbers, if you have a movie, a quote Black movie, they're probably getting 3/5, ironically, of the budgets that an equivalent non-Black film would get. They're getting less marketing. They're getting distribution in fewer international territories. And despite all of that, dollar for dollar, those movies return more on their investment than non-Black movies, right? So this is an actual misalignment in inputs and outputs that the industry has perpetuated over decades. And it comes as a result of a lot of things, but in the investment part comes as a result of a conventional wisdom in the industry that it's impossible to sell Black movies abroad, and that there's less of an audience for Black movies domestically simply because they're Black. And, there's a lot of things in Hollywood that function as a result of, that are all convention and no wisdom, I like to say. And that's a great example of it. Coming to America, I think, did $200 million outside of the US in the mid 80s. Big Mama's House 2 did better business internationally than Failure to Launch, which came out around the same time with Matthew McConaughey and Kate Hudson. But people are oblivious to those things because it doesn't confirm their priors, and they're unwilling to adjust when those priors are confronted. And that doesn't even say anything about the fact that, when Ava DuVernay walks into a room, people don't see her as the next Spielberg, even though everything about her communicates the next Spielberg, and all of the positive things that means. So I think that there's just a gross undervaluing of people who are not part of a sort of white, straight, male, upper middle class default, right? I think the same thing is true when it comes to Me Too. I don't think, and there's so many ways to think and talk about this, but all of them infuriate me. I don't know how anyone ever thought it was a good idea to have a business whose primary purpose is to entertain the world be run by people who are all part of a similar demographic community. Like, that doesn't make sense to me. Like, if you were trying to run a business that makes products for everyone, and they're particularly cultural products, the idea that the leadership of that industry should be a group of people with a near identical life experience just doesn't make sense to me. And I think that time and time again, study after study after study confirms that having women in leadership positions reduces the amount of abuse across the board in those things. You get better business results, et cetera. So again, you look around and you're like, how did we end up in this situation? It's not because it's the optimal business situation. It's because individual actors were optimizing for their own gains and not the gains of their companies or the industry. But I will say, going back to this sort of pure quant stuff, and just like there was conventional wisdom that you can't sell black movies abroad, there was a conventional wisdom that female action didn't work. Like I remember hearing this early in my career, you can't make a female-driven action movie. They all fail. And so when things like Hunger Games circulated the industry, most of the studios passed. I believe it was Summit or Lionsgate, and the producer Nina Jacobson, who was able to pick it up for a relatively small amount of money because people didn't realize that there was an audience for female-driven action. And if you think about it, James Cameron's done a pretty good job making a lot of money with female-driven action. Terminator, female-driven action movie. Titanic, female-driven action movie. So again, there's just all these assumptions. Female-driven action doesn't work. Black people can't sell abroad. That's all convention and no wisdom. And I have to say, I've never heard a single bit of conventional wisdom about a white male hero that makes an argument negatively against its box office. Never once. And I can't imagine why that is. And I actually want to address the economic exclusion as well. So yeah, look, here's the thing. I remember when I got the job as an assistant at CAA, I was lucky that I'd saved a little bit of money from my consulting job, which was allowing me to make this transition from New York to Los Angeles. But I still had to fly back to Houston, Texas, where my parents were living now, and buy my grandmother's Nissan Altima and drive it to Los Angeles. I remember driving into the parking lot my first day of work in that Nissan Altima, like not a new model Nissan Altima either, and driving into the assistant parking lot and passing BMWs and Mercedes. Most of the assistants that I was working with came from upper middle class, if not, let's say, highly upper middle class backgrounds. As did I, by the way. I was lucky in that I knew that if I flamed out with this job that I was making, $20,000 a year, I could always go home and my parents had my back. But there is no real scenario for a person that does not have that sort of soft landing to pursue a career as a professional film industry person without literally risking their well-being. And I don't necessarily advise that anybody do that. Like, you got to keep the lights on, you got to keep food on the table, you got to take care of your family. And I think that that's at the root of a lot of the industry's failures in general, because as a result of that, you lose out on all of the talent that might be available to the industry as a whole that doesn't happen to grow up either rich enough to move to Los Angeles without a job or without a way to make money, or doesn't, have a parent who interacts socially with people who are already in the business. And that's most of the world. And so if you imagine if the NBA or any professional sports league filled its rosters with only people who were social relationships of the owners of the team, I don't think anybody would watch basketball. I don't think anybody would watch professional football or soccer. That's roughly the way Hollywood functions. Most of the people who are in Hollywood's employ at a high level are the friends of the social relationships of the people who are already there. They are not people who the industry went out into the world to find the most talented, merit-filled people and said, "You're amazing. We're going to do everything we can so that you and I can make money together."
And you and Ellen are both commenting on what is a pretty pernicious issue around the lack of diversity in this industry. I wonder, though, did you, at its core, as you started to build this community, at its core, it seems to me there's a collective enterprise, that the nature of a collective list by its very existence has to be diverse. There's diversification, like a diversified stock portfolio. You're diversifying risk, you're diversifying voice, you're diversifying input. And even though the common denominator is the writing, which I love so much, do you think that that's what's made it recession-proof and foolproof and expandable and scalable and meaningful to so many people for so long?
The short answer is yes, but there's some things I want to unpack there. So, when I started the Blacklist, it really was not I think a lot of people were like, "Oh, Franklin, you're doing such great activist work. You're diversifying Hollywood." And I think, sure, but that actually isn't the goal for me. Like, I actually don't sit around thinking a lot about how I can diversify Hollywood. I spend a lot more time thinking about how I can make Hollywood more of a meritocracy, because I know that if it was more of a true meritocracy, real diversity would be inevitable. Because I don't believe, and I don't think anybody believes, that any group of people has a exclusive or competitive advantage when it comes to storytelling, right? Like I don't think that Black women, white men, queer folks in mass, there's no, this group is more gifted at storytelling. Maybe there's some arguments you can make culturally, but I think generally speaking, you're born, everybody has a roughly equal aptitude for storytelling, and that's something that you cultivate as a craft over time. It's true for, I think, all artists. I think the reason you've seen such a lack of diversity in Hollywood is because it's not a meritocracy, because there's a lot of it's a socially driven business. The people who have those relationships have a significantly greater chance of having success once you have a door open to you if you actually are talented. And so for me, this enterprise is far more about how do we make sure that the industry is finding the best people? And I think if you find the best people, you're going to be recession proof. Your business is going to be better. And I think that's kind of what the annual Blacklist proves and the Harvard Business School study proves, is like, find the best stuff. Don't worry about where it comes from. Don't worry about who writes it. Just find the best stuff. If you look at the early Blacklists, right, where I was surveying executives in Hollywood, there's not a lot of diversity. It's still overwhelmingly white men. There are few women, but very few. You've seen those numbers improve over time, and I think that's a reflection of a slowly shifting, basket of people who are voting in the list, because the basket of executives has changed slowly, particularly at the lower levels, which is disproportionately what I'm surveying. We're not seeing a lot of change at the very top. But at the junior executive level, at the VP level, I think there's probably more diversity than there was when I entered 20 years ago. And you see the annual list reflect that diversity of experiences, responses to storytelling, et cetera, in a way that you wouldn't have several decades ago.
You're a member of the Academy, aren't you?
I am.
So post 2020, like all organizations, they made some big promises around diversity and inclusion. Have you seen any progress? Is it making any kind of a difference?
I think that the Academy did a really good job in addressing its membership failures, in making sure that folks who had been contributing significantly to the Hollywood community were invited to join the Academy equivalent with their contributions. And I think you're seeing the beginnings of change in the choices that it makes for its awards as a consequence. The rest of the changes that it's made, I don't detect any much significance from them. Like, I know there's these inclusion standards for being nominated for Best Picture, but that's only for being nominated for Best Picture, and they are the lowest standards possible to make the point that, yes, the Academy believes that this is important, so we will make a nod to it, but they're not stringent enough that anyone really has to change anything about how they're making their movies or what companies they're working with in order to be eligible. Like, you would have to try very hard to be ineligible based on those standards. I will also say this, though. Personally, I don't care if a movie is made by all white men, right? I don't care. If that movie's great. I will watch it. I will praise it. I'm looking for hits. I'm looking for bangers, the best in class. For me, what I care about is not that a bunch of white men who decide, hey, we want to make and distribute a movie. Like, I'm not trying to stop them. I just want to make sure that if there's a group of Black women or Asian women or queer filmmakers who want to do the same thing, who will make a movie as good as those white men, I want to make sure that they have the same resources available to them to make and distribute the movie. And so I get really uncomfortable when it's like, oh, you have to have these numbers, et cetera, et cetera. I'm much more interested in an ecosystem that supports all great artists, not in telling artists how they need to be making what they're making.
I'm here with Kwesi Mitchell, Deloitte's Chief Purpose and DEI Officer and good friend and sponsor of today's episode. Good to see you, Kwesi. Thank you for joining us.
It's good to be here, Ellen.
Kwesi, in recent years, we've seen, and I've reported on, big shifts in the way the business community approaches equity. Tell us what you've been seeing.
There's a few things that I've been seeing as part of the shift. I would say several years ago, Ellen, so much of the efforts of the business community was identifying talent in some of our more traditional sources, largely from, colleges and universities, people with 4 years degrees. What I've started to see is the shift is expansion of that particular pipeline and looking at things such as talent sources that do not obtain or have 4 year degrees. And in addition to that, an increased focus on retention and advancement, which is something that you have reported on for so many years, and the need for a heavier focus in those areas rather than only the identification of talent in and of itself.
That's very encouraging. And so when we take this view, what's your call to action for the business community?
Call to action for the business community is for us to spend some time really observing what is taking place within the doors of our organization that are driving perhaps inequitable outcomes across our broader workforce. And that could be so many distinct capacities, everything from how are we sourcing talent, how are we selecting people for development programs, to how are we spending times with respect to leadership development activities. And so all of those things together, it's really critical for the business community to observe their own actions and use that as the starting point for driving change.
It was great to hear concrete ways we can move forward. Thank you for your time, Kwesi.
Thank you for the opportunity, Ellen. It's been a pleasure.
Where do you see the blacklist 20 years from now?
It's a very good question. I think that what I'd say is, so the blacklist exists to identify and celebrate great storytelling, great written storytelling. I think that there are no real limitations on what kinds of written storytelling we should be trying to identify and celebrate. I think that if we have the ability to do that globally, efficiently, and consistently, we'll be able to build a lot of businesses on top of that ability. If you can find all of the great screenplays, plays, books, whatever, and identify them as having value before everybody else, you can build a pretty exciting business around that. And I think that's the direction that we're headed. And if anybody would like to invest in said business, they should give me a call.
I hear Diane von Furstenberg might be interested.
Look, we've built a lot on top of that annual survey, right? We have a website now where people can get feedback on their work from professional readers, no matter where in the world they are. If that feedback is received positively, we tell everybody in Hollywood, hey, this is a good script. You should do something with it. There are writers literally all around the world who sign with agents and managers, had their movies produced, some of which not even in the English language. And our ability to identify that work and to connect that work with the right people has grown considerably in recent years. I mean, in the last 2 years alone, the Blacklist website distributed more than $1.2 million to writers directly via development deals and grants for short films, et cetera. And I increasingly believe that that's just the tip of the iceberg with what we can do to transform the industry. And comparatively speaking, we need very, very little resources to do transformative work compared to what a lot of other people are investing to increase their company's fortunes.
You've been such a powerful voice for the meaning of movies in people's lives. I saw Origin, for example, in a theater. I live most of the year in a white flight community suburb of St. Louis, which is another podcast for how I got there. But I watched it in a theater just 10 miles from Ferguson. And I was one of 6 people in the theater. And, partly it was the time of day. I did it to myself. But I was craving a communal experience. And that's not always possible. And it's not good for the industry if movies were only seen in person. How do you see the future of meaning in movies playing out with films showing up on tiny screens, maybe beamed into our brains? How are we able to leverage the meaning and impact of great storytelling going forward?
So Look, I'm a huge fan of the communal movie going experience. I'm on the board of the American Cinematheque, which is, here in Los Angeles, is explicitly about protecting and saving the communal film experience in Los Angeles and beyond. I have incredibly fond and precise memories of going to see Jurassic Park in the theater when it came out. I think I saw it 3 times opening weekend. And I still just really love the notion of walking into a dark room with a bunch of people I don't know and having a 2 to 3 hour experience that changes the way I view what it means to be alive with a bunch of people I don't know. I think of it as a religious experience. It's not very different than going to a church, synagogue, mosque, and having a sermon about. It's a story. The sermon is always a story, and you leave buttressed against the hard things in life. But I also think that like the impact of movies, you may have a different experience watching something in a theater, but I don't think that means that seeing it at home on your television, on your phone, God forbid, beamed into our brain means that those things have any less value. And I think that what we can mean when we talk about a communal experience can extend to I saw something and then I engaged in a conversation with it about it online with other people, and it informed how I communicate, what I learn about the world, how I interact with people when I leave the theater. I think one of my heroes, Martin Scorsese, like he saw some of his first films on television, not in a theater. Did it have less of an impact on him because he saw them on a television? Probably a very small television in black and white with not a great, picture. I don't think it does. And I also think that, and I'm obviously biased here, having grown up in a small town in West Central Georgia and not having access to a great deal of world cinema, independent cinema, I think that there's extremely good things about streaming, making movies available to everyone to participate as part of that communal experience. And I do think there's an argument, and look, it hasn't been borne out yet, and it's highly dependent on how these streamers develop their business model. But I do think it's possible that can be helpful in allowing filmmakers to have sustainable careers that allow them to continue to make the kinds of movies that they want, and not necessarily things that need to be driven by the largest possible opening weekend at the theatrical box office. Because if that is a necessity, business folks, the studios are justified in making some of the conservative business decisions they make, because they know that in order to have a financial success, you got to deliver opening weekend theatrical box office. If that becomes less of a preoccupation, it opens up the kinds of things that can be made, because they can be made using different business models at lower prices, etc. So I'm a pessimist by nature and an optimist by practice, and so I believe it is possible that the future will give us some models that allows film to matter even more, because I think that as human beings, we have a natural disposition to seeking out stories about what this brief, painful life means and how we can survive it. And I think one of the things that, regardless of culture, most of those stories on some level come back to the extent to which we need other people in order for this life to have meaning.
But is there some larger societal level of understanding opposing viewpoints, of enlarging perspectives, of being able to withstand tension and drama and think about a denouement in a different way? Do you see it at a sort of larger orbit, that there's a potential for movies to really change the world?
I would argue that it's inarguable that movies change the world. I think what you're describing is the best case scenario for movies changing the world. And I think, unfortunately, there's the flip side of that, which is that movies can change the world for the negative. It's not lost on me that, Hollywood's first blockbuster, Birth of a Nation, was responsible for rebirthing the Klan and gifting them a lot of their iconography that didn't previously exist. Like, it came from that movie. It's not lost on me that, we have a problem in America, really the world, with the notion, the perceived inherent violence of Black men. Right, that goes back to Birth of a Nation. That continues through present day. I think there was a study done a couple of years ago that found that 2/3 of gang members in Hollywood films are Black. But the FBI statistics are that 1/3 of gang members are Black. In the same way that we can learn about all those things badly because of the stories we tell, presumably we also can learn about, what could be better from the same thing. I think, unfortunately, there are far fewer examples of that, but I do know that they exist. There are two quotes that I sort of savor, and I'm not going to be able to get them perfectly right, but they're from a manifesto that the animator Hayao Miyazaki wrote, I think, in the mid-'80s. One is, I think, if maybe I can get this right, a popular movie should be full of true human emotion, even if it's base. The entrance should be low and wide so that everyone can be welcomed in, but the exit should be high and purified. It shouldn't be anything that emphasizes or enlarges the lowness. So that is a definition of a popular movie that I've tried to think seriously about when I think about things that I want to be involved in. The other thing he talks about is that when you make a movie, you have no idea about the emotional state of the person who is watching it. That they could be going through a divorce. They could have just lost their child. They could have gotten a promotion. They could have had a great day. And part of your job as a filmmaker is to take them away from whatever that is for the time that they're watching the movie and leave them more prepared to navigate and survive the things that they're going through when they leave.
On that cheerful note, it is a cheerful note, actually. You're talking about so many things that I think are going to be of great interest to our listeners, and they're certainly of great interest to us. Tell us, though, because we're dying to know, what was the last movie you saw that you loved?
I think Origin was probably the last movie that I saw that I really loved. I think it reduced me to tears multiple times. I think it really does. I think it is a wildly ambitious film that attempts to articulate a sort of unified field theory of human existence, about what makes life hard and how we survive it. I think the love story at the center of it is one of the most heartbreaking I've seen in a very long time. I think Ava's just a beautiful filmmaker. So that's probably the last movie I saw that I loved. But there are a lot of them. Anatomy of a Fall, incredible film. Can't recommend it highly enough.
Anything from you, Franklin, that we should have asked?
I mean, look, I think the thing that I continue to be most proud of is beyond the annual Blacklist is what we've built on top of it. The Blacklist website, which I encourage everyone to check out. It really does exist as an ecosystem where no matter who you are, where you are, who you know, what your background is, if you have a great screenplay, you can get it to people who can do something with it. If you have a great pilot, you have a great play, you can get it to people who can do something with it. There's a small fee, but there's also a fee waiver. But I really do encourage anyone who is a writer to check out our website, create a writer profile on it. That's free. But if you have a script and you don't have the ability to get it to somebody who can do something with it, give us a serious look. And I know that as we continue to have more resources, we're going to be able to do things that can be a tide that raises all boats in the industry.
Thank you so much for your time today. This is great.
That was an absolute pleasure.
I love what you said at the beginning before Franklin joined us about the case for equity and inclusion not being about lowering the bar. And if there was a poster child for that, it might be Franklin Leonard. I mean, this is not a person, this is impeccable, capacious, meticulous understanding of this complicated world as somebody who really has, I think, the best kind of skin in the game. And I just got to listen to him forever.
I know. He's always been that person, and he works to hone that perspective and his skill and talents and insights. And he takes on another trope very naturally, that of meritocracy, and the idea that he thinks that a true meritocracy where people are allowed in would give way to true diversity. And I think he's onto something there as well.
You know what that music means.
It's big swing, small wins time.
I think we're going to have to ask Warner to write lyrics for the little intro music. Okay. Wouldn't that be funny? Okay.
That would be funny.
What's our big swing for this week, Ellen?
I'm excited about this. In honor of Franklin in our conversation today, I am calling out Maya Kadeh, who's the scholar in residence at the Library of Congress. She's incredible. Starting in 2020, talk about a pandemic project, she created the Black Film Archive to correct the lack of Black film in traditional archives. She calls it a living register of Black film, blackfilmarchive.com. It goes back to, Jessica, it goes back to 1898.
Unbelievable.
She is really doing the work, and I am so grateful for her. That's a big swing and a big gift to all of us. And now it's time for small wins. Jessica, what you got?
I'm going to take this. So last week was my birthday, not that I'm having any more of those. And my partner Phil took me to see the Boston Symphony Orchestra and Esperanza Spalding doing an entire Wayne Shorter program. Now, there's not enough time in the world for me to talk about how much I love Esperanza Spalding. We were actually on a fellowship together years ago, not many years ago, but she is, of course, just a polymath, vocalist, bassist, and multiple Grammy winner. Boy, talk about a redesigner. She did this entire program about Wayne Shorter, who we lost during the pandemic. He passed away in March of 23. There's nothing like seeing this. It's an opera. She sings excerpts from Iphigenia, which is an opera that Wayne Shorter wrote shortly before he died. And she was very involved in working with him as a librettist, as a lyricist, as a sort of co-conspirator. And she introduces every part of this concert with a short anecdote about her relationship to the late, great Wayne Shorter. It was tremendous to see this beautiful, little, huge talent in a little body. She's got like a 19-octave range and this enormous orchestra. It was very moving. It was very powerful. And talk about somebody who is rethinking and redesigning music in ways that are accessible, that retell stories of the power dynamics of women and Greek tragedy and Euripides and what it means to go to a concert hall and hear jazz. It was just tremendous, and I'll never forget it.
I love that. I love that. These small wins taken together make a breakthrough career. So well done. Rest in power, Wayne Shorter. Well, that's all for today. We will see you back here in 2 weeks with another redesigner who is transforming their community, their field, and our world. The Design of Business, the Business of Design is a podcast from Design Observer.
Our show is written and produced by Alexis Haught. Theme music is by Warner Meadows. Justin D. Wright of Seaplane Armada mixed and mastered this episode. Thanks to Adina Karp and Focus Forward Podcast Studio in Providence for production support.
Anybody else you want to thank today, Jessica?
And we want to thank our colleagues at Curious Minds, who are helping us redesign the very site that Design Observer lives on. Eric, Andrew, Shannon, and the entire team at Curious Minds, a big thank you.
And for more long-form content about the people redesigning our world, not just our website, please consider subscribing to our newsletters, Equity Observer and The Observatory. Head over to designobserver.com. The Design of Business, the Business of Design is produced by Design Observer's editorial team. The views and opinions expressed by podcast speakers and guests are solely their own and do not reflect the opinions of Deloitte or its personnel, nor does Deloitte advocate or endorse any individuals or entities featured on the podcasts.